we need to prepare our buyer for, you may not get away with just yours. You may have to buy out of the contract. That is out where a buyer literally has to pay the seller money to buy out. But if you already moved, incurred expenses, all that kind of stuff. What's the price of the property?
385.
How much?
385 is the final sale price.
That presumes you sell it as an individual, not this corporation or investor or what?
No, it's not investor.
Um, worst thing about this is you guys had a closing coming up. That's not gonna.
I
That's
know.
all.
We're like, okay, we did everything
Yeah,
possible.
but do we know what we need to tell them? It's unfortunate, but this is a buyer I don't think you can trust. Not just based on what you told me. You told them, you explained to them, they didn't do what you told them.
Yeah. We at this point feel like she's not being honest with us.
Yeah,
And we're just like, we're just trying to close her, and if we can't close her, we're done.
yeah.
Because she was just not giving us,
Advisors, we're good, thanks, sir. So advise them in writing, legal advice, you need to talk to an attorney, go through the process, and you need to give us instructions. Tell the other side you're not gonna close. We're not gonna tell the other side you're not gonna close until we have something in writing from the buyer. Because they'll change their mind later. Oh, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean for you to tell them that. We're all screwed down. It's all your fault because you told them something that I didn't mean it. So,
Well, we,
somebody like that, you can't trust
the
them.
initial one we did is there's at least one game. So you
You have
have
something from the seller, from the buyer saying that.
the buyer verbally told us that.
Okay, so that ain't right. So then I'll get them to acknowledge an email. Okay, you've seen the email. I just need you to acknowledge that I in fact have advised the other side, instructed me to advise the other side. And I need for you to acknowledge that I've advised you to seek legal.
you talk to her. Next time is right.
Buyer, qualifying questions, excuse me, are you a player? Are you allowed to come back? Not sure I can represent you if you're that kind of person, so
Well, she's not, we've done 2 transactions with her.
so in the past, she's performed.
Yeah.
But what's happened? Something going on?
Right now about the money, about the fact that, how much money she just made it a big
So
deal.
we're not sure where she really got this.
But she has the money, she sold a house in Las Vegas.
The thing is,
She needs to show this money out.
She moved them around too many times, from one account to the other account, and then she put some money in there, she made a big purchase, and then she went home. Because she wanted to take everything out of the bank, shut it
Trying
down.
to hide it from the books.
Yeah, just trying to have an account, just trying to do. Yeah.
That's what I know. Okay, y'all get the documents from the back?
Sure. I did.
Get the paperwork back here?
Yes, I
Here's a whole bunch of
I
stuff.
have a question. Friday, I asked you about this one, and then I sent for the email for the user fields. Until now, she did not return.
There's a sales rep.
Yeah.
Is he gonna do it?
Say he will, but I know he said, he just send me your records and say, okay, everything about the process, the records always, maybe wait.
Well, I mean, we need to have him do this. If not, it's gonna need to go through inspection. Tell him that if you're gonna want to continue to work with me and my buyers, I need something from you. Otherwise,
And it's funny.
I'm not gonna be able to do this and you're gonna have to work with it.
Yeah, it could have crossed.
We've got to have him do this, so you've got to push him.
That was it. That's right.
No, it's nine hours with you. That's the issue. You mentioned here, yeah, just join. It's your first one. Yeah, that's always what first week. Yeah, because I joined the Friday night. Okay. Yeah, so very new. Very, started with your time. Are you with the, here just the next nine?
They forget, because it's very new, but at least if it's in writing, back to them and say.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I already
Yeah,
done bill,
they-
7 months. Yeah, but I switched the two. I'm looking for the someone.
Exactly, good things, and then she had a summer, a lot of transaction, and then it just was more respond, then some was just like, I would do, yearly because of my friends, they. I would give her a lot of stress, so I do think she's got about this way. I've already. I do, so.
Now, we're in which program? I just went out to the.
You know, it is what it is.
And the other one is, yeah, but I always stay in there 2 weeks, 2 months. It doesn't like it. Drive me crazy. Session. There's. Take a couple of these, right? Some of the also said they always in.
And then change the couple of people, and that way you never know what.
I think that's a lot. It's very crazy, so, you know, when we make out. It's like much of my nervous, right? And you even know how to feel. That in their home part. They think about, that's the other positive thing I do in there. Then I think it also she did really. Oh. So I don't say it's done. Yeah.
But we're moving forward on this thing under us, based on what the sales rep is telling us. They haven't executed a contract yet, to get us to do this because you're now under our, and if he doesn't get that done, we can't move forward on that. Because, you know, technically you were in a buyer rep agreement, the XP before
Yes.
this was done, and we'd have to talk to your team or whatever and say, okay, here's what we've got. What do you want to do to see what kind of participation they want in you.
So I
You
can,
gotta get that done right away. I mean, me yesterday. Or we're gonna have to work through EXP on it, because we're doing all of this based on the sales rep telling us, yeah, this contract is gonna go through Keller Williams. Gotta get them to agree to that.
so I need to talk to the ESP team leader or broker.
Well, if this guy won't take care, we need to talk to whoever your lead person is at EXP and say, okay, here's what's happened. Builder sales rep, says, you know, we didn't have a contract yet. We're doing it now, and I'm at Keller Williams, and I just want to make sure that we're okay with what how we're gonna move forward.
I'm gonna team lead.
Okay.
Have you know the sales agent? This sales agent's.
Oh,
She
well,
didn't,
yeah.
we called him, no answer the phone 3 days. I
Yeah.
just say, he just said everything going on.
It's a real challenge sometimes. It really is.
And I go to the model home. He locked the door.
Oh,
Do you want to sell house or not?
wow,
He said, we appointment only. Really,
really?
right now?
Wow. So it sounds like he may not want to still do the deal.
I know, because of, I do this transaction 2 weeks ago, and then he say, go to vacation 2 weeks after he comes back, and then contact you. And they don't have a other sales agent.
Are you gonna sit back there, Miss Marcia, even though you're our co-teacher person? But we got some space up here. Back if you have your paperwork. You can- Everybody get their documents, just go ahead and try to get started. Some other people may wander in. As we work through it, and we do have some Zoomers. Like we've got 12 Zoomers. Okay, good. Hello, Zoomers. Can you hear me okay? Give me a.
Hello,
Hello, give me a wave. Yeah, you can hear you, Bob. We're good.
Can
Thank you
hear
for
you.
being here. Yeah, but I can't hear you. I can, so good. Okay, good. Okay, so we're gonna talk today about this issue that Marcia says keeps happening over and over and over and over and over again. Is that what you?
That's exactly what I
That's
said.
exactly what she said. When we have a transaction, and while we're gonna focus specifically on the procedure in doing a repair request, we're gonna talk about that whole process. And as you can tell, it's not just a pop and go kind of, I mean, there's 6 steps to it. There's a lot involved. But some of what we're gonna talk about is involved throughout the transaction. I mean, the things that we're talking about is important, like when you're first making the offer, when you're going through the process, when you're moving from, contract to closing, all those things. Because some of these concepts in here apply because they all come down to you and how you interact with the client. That's really key. That's really important here. One of the things you need to understand as an agent is that you have the big picture. You've got the better understanding, even as a brand new agent, you've got the better understanding of everything that's going on. You know what's going on in the market, you know what's going on with your clients, you know what's going on with the transaction, dealing with the lender, with the title company, all those pieces, and your client doesn't have all those pieces. You do. And so when you're advising them and helping go through the process, you're doing it with that big picture in your mind. You're kind of helping them understand as you work through all that. We're going to go through the steps here and I want you to really feel comfortable asking questions. And, Marcia can give some of her things that she's seen agents do as she goes through the transaction, say, yeah, here's what happens. But as we focus primarily on how we get to that point where you're going to create an amendment and your buyer is going to request of the seller, here's some repairs we'd like to have done. And so how do we get to that point? What's the process that we go through? And the very first step here is, you've got to help your client understand where's the information coming from that will lead them to ask for something. Is it just out of the blue say, I'd really like to have whatever. There's a source of information. Now, the big one generally is the seller's disclosure notice. That's a big one. The bigger one is the inspection report that we'll see in the next point there. But the seller's disclosure notice, you need to be familiar with that as an agent. And the one that we use in this office is the 6-page Texas Realtor Seller's Disclosure Notice. It's more information than the little 4-page tracker. You need to be familiar with it. And one of the things that you need to know is, when your buyer is getting information from the seller's disclosure notice, the buyer is getting information from the seller on what the seller thinks about the condition of the property. Everything that leads up to the buyer asking for repairs and making requests is going to come from, what does the seller think? What's going on here from the seller's perspective? That's in the seller's disclosure notice. And there are only 2 basic types of questions in the seller's disclosure notice. One is a fact question, which is in section 1, what's there? There's an AC there, what kind of roof is there, all that. Those are fact questions, and all the others are awareness questions. Are you aware of that? We see this in section 8, and we see this section 4 that talks about, are you aware of a defect? Which is, when they ask things like, are you aware of foundation issue? Are you aware of whatever? It's not a fact question. It's what does the seller think? But the buyer needs to really reflect on what the seller tells them in the seller's disclosure notice. I talk often about the most common lawsuit in real estate is the buyer suing the seller after closing, or the seller either failing to disclose or misrepresenting something. A big part of that is in the seller's disclosure notice. Seller Shield, which is a service that should be in your listing package, that offers essentially kind of an E&O for the seller. So if they get sued by the buyer within the next 2 years, they've got some coverage. And one of the things they really emphasize is they've got a video and they've got paperwork in there. Have you used it?
It's a lot.
Yeah. Where the seller can make use of the Seller Shield to do things as simple as how to complete the seller disclosure notice and how much the buyer is going to rely on that so that they do it correctly.
You want to say something about that?
Yes, please.
So Seller Shield is a great company. And if you go to the website, sellershield.com, they have tutorials there to help you, whether you represent the buyer or seller, to understand what it is and how you should present it to your client. When you have a seller
you know, Bob says it should be in your listing packet. That's something that you need to print out and make sure that they have it, even if they don't use it. They can fill out the seller disclosure for free. The coverage as far as, you know, the E&O type coverage that they get, there's a cost for that. They can either pay for it upfront or they can pay at closing. It's like $199 for 1 year, $299, $399, that kind of thing. But they don't have to do that if they don't want to. You know, that can be their choice, but it's great to have them use it to fill out the seller's disclosure because it helps as they go through it. The video, when they're doing it, it helps kind of remind them of things. 'Cause sometimes when you've lived in a house for a really long time, you forget that you had a leak. You know, you forget that the AC went out and you had to do something. So it's nice that it prompts you along the way, prompts the seller along the way to kind of understand, and it explains things, whereas we're not supposed to have anything to do with that disclosure. We're not supposed to interpret or explain anything. It helps explain to the seller what this term might mean or what that might mean. It's a
Yeah.
good product.
Exactly. It is good and it really does help. Because she's right. They forget. They forget what they've done to the house. They lived there for 20 years and they don't remember. And this really does prompt them and helps them complete it. Because one of the things that a good seller's disclosure notice does is it helps the buyer feel good about the seller. It helps them trust them because any little thing that the buyer finds out that the buyer says, well, you lied about that or you failed to do that, may not be what happened. May just be the seller just didn't remember. Not trying to pull anything over anybody. And so when you have a good complete one that the seller does a good job on it, the buyer feels better about it. And one of the key elements of getting this thing from contract to closing is the buyer and seller are getting along. They don't hate each other. They feel good about each other. When it changes, you got a real challenge. And part of that for the agents, part of that is helping them go through the process, feeling good about the other side. And self-disclosure notice is an important part of that. So you need to have an awareness of it. You need to understand what it is. And your buyer, on one hand, when you receive the seller disclosure notice, your buyer needs to review it. They need to look at it. They need to look at things. You know, the seller may say something in there about to replace the roof, 2 years ago or whatever. They need to understand that they're getting the important condition information. Because you've got to kind of catch all into each section for comments. Is there anything in here that you need to comment for? And the buyer can rely on or should rely on what the seller says. Now, the other side of that is the seller needs to understand that when they put something in there, somebody's going to rely on them and it could be a legal reliance. So they need to really make sure they understand that. But when your buyer is reviewing that seller disclosure notice, you need to know what's in there. So when your buyer says, well, what does that mean? What the heck is oak wilt? They say that there's no oak wilt. I don't even know what that is. You need to be able to have a conversation with your buyer. Now, you'll never have a conversation with a seller and explain what oak wilt is, because that's one of the sections that's an awareness question. If the seller, if the seller is not aware of what oak wilt is, and that question where it asks, is there oak wilt, doesn't ask if there's oak wilt, and asks, is the seller aware of it? So the seller says, well, I don't know what it is, so how can I be aware? That sounds like you need to check that box then, you're not aware. So the buyer needs to understand when the seller checks certain boxes, especially in the awareness sections, it doesn't mean that something is there or not there, it just means the seller doesn't know. And you just need to understand that limitation. So remember what we're doing is we're building information for the buyer on the condition of the property to get some really important points towards the end of this about why that's important to the buyer. Not just for the use, but for the value, is it worth what he's paying for it, that type of thing. So we're helping the buyer look at this stuff, not just as another document, another piece of whatever, but this is important information as you're going to move forward and you're going to gain information about the condition of the property from many different sources. And the seller's disclosure notice is the major source from the seller, telling the buyer, yeah, here's what I know about the property on this day that I signed the seller's disclosure notice. Not a year ago, not today, but on that day that I signed it. And by the way, if you've got one and it's 6 months old or a year old, then the buyer may say, I kind of need something current. Because things have happened. And you see this sometimes when you've got a seller And he's been renting out the property, or it's been sitting there vacant for a year or two, and he filled out this form before. So you know what, things have happened to the property since then, so we need to revisit this. And work through that. That makes sense so far? Good. Anything you want to add to that before we go to the inspection? The big thing that agents and buyers tend to rely on is they're going to have the property inspected. In fact, in our E&O insurance, one of the things that we're required is that there be an inspection in the transaction, or the buyer completes documents saying why they're not going to do an inspection. We offered it up, we suggested it. In fact, if we've got a buyer who chooses not to do an inspection, we have a form for that. We have a form they've got to sign off on to acknowledge that we've advised them to have an inspection done, and they've chosen not to do it. The paperwork right there in the back.
It's not, it's in our form, it's our.
It's in our, yeah, it's our form. It's not a TREC or a TR form, it's our form. That's one of several forms that we have that's an advisory type of form. So as you work through that process and make sure you understand it, when the buyer is getting all this information, they're working through and they're relying on certain kinds of things. They've gone past the self-disclosure, and now the buyers move to their responsibilities. The buyer says, okay, I got information from the other side. Now I'm going to hire my own person, my own inspector. That's their inspector, and you'll have a list of inspectors. You can, provide them that. And there's a vendor policy form that they have to sign off on, where we basically tell them, here are some people that we've had good experience with, or someone whose opinion we respect has had a good experience. We're not recommending them. We're not endorsing them. We're not saying these people are great and perfect and never make mistakes. We're simply, as a service, providing you these persons, and we need for them to sign off and acknowledge it. Because one of the huge things that we've got to have our client believe and understand, when they hire that inspector, that is their inspector, not our inspector. A little lawsuit that we're in right now, well, actually, it'll be a lawsuit. It's a complaint right now. One of the things that the plaintiff attorney said, and they're the ones who represent people who are suing us, is they said that our agent hired an inspector. Well, our agent didn't hire an inspector. In fact, our agent is on a team that goes overboard and makes sure that here's the list. And by the way, here's how this works. These are not our people, these are your people. And we encourage you to just, they went overboard in making sure that the buyer understood, yeah, this is not our inspector, but that's what they said in it. So you need to make sure as you're going through the process and you're providing information to your client, they need to say, understand, this is just information you're providing them. They've got to do research. They've got to talk to the people. They've got to say, they go with inspectors and title companies and lenders and home warranty companies, foundation people, structural engineers, roofers, all the way across the board. So they need to understand, yeah, we've got to, in fact, we provide them the information, but they've got to have the responsibility to make the decision and go through the process. So when they have an inspection done and they choose an inspector off the list, they understand that's their inspector. They're paying for it, it's their inspector. That's the relationship. Every once in a while, somebody said, well, maybe we shouldn't give them a list at all. Just let them Google it up. So I think that's wrong. They have a right to benefit from our experiences. If we say, yeah, just Google it up and they get a bad inspector, they're going to blame us. And they probably should. They do have a right. We've got experiences. And one of the things that we know, we've got good vendors. We got bad vendors. Hopefully none of them are on that wall out there, but anyway. But even good vendors will make a mistake. One of the complaints that we're dealing with right now is the buyer is also suing one of the vendors situation, a roofer kind of person, and again accusing this of being our roofer. And the reality is, when a buyer works with a contractor, usually, which we're getting to there in number 3 there, they need to understand where the relationship is. They need to not see us as set things up. And it's kind of a balance because we're coordinating things. We're helping them, get an inspector out there, get a roofer out there, get a foundation out there. We're helping that, but they need to understand that's simply a service we're providing We're not in charge. We didn't just become a general contractor. So we worked through that. So inspection report, which could also include construction engineers reports, things of that nature. And then under C, contractor reports. You may have a roofer go out, and what we want is to get a good report, you know, and not good report, but get a report. Same thing with a foundation company, HVAC, electrician, plumber. We want something in writing. When they go out, we want something in writing. Now, sometimes you'll have several, especially in the area of foundation companies and roofers. You may have several go out, take a look at it. You may have several reports. So one of the rules on reports is that once our client has one or two or three, how many reports, and they're looking at it and they're choosing which one to use, the buyer has a lot of latitude in what they want to do in requesting something of the seller. The buyer can in fact say, okay, here's an inspection report I have and it says we need, 12 piers. Here's a contractor, foundation company said we need 12 piers. And the same buyer may have another one that says they only need 6. The buyer doesn't have to use all the reports to have as a basis for their request. The seller does. If the seller has done reports from contractors, foundation, structural engineers, roofers, things like that, and they've got one that's good and one that's bad, the seller doesn't get to pick and choose. Seller's got to provide all that they have. Buyer can decide which one they like that supports what they want to have done. Buyer gets to do that. Seller doesn't get to do that. That makes sense. We good on that. Now, sometimes the challenge, we'll have the question. I know Marcia gets it, and I get it, where seller says, well, I really like this one, but I don't like this one. So do I have to, if I give up this one, do I have to give up this one? Yes, you do. You can't pick and choose. Because one, it's such a small world. People will end up talking to that foundation company, talking to those people and getting and say, oh, well, didn't they give us the report? We were just out here 3 weeks ago. Oops. You didn't disclose it. You didn't tell them about it. So that's a little bit of a challenge. And then the last one, observation by the buyer and also by the agent. Might tell me about that. Remember, what we're doing here is we're accumulating information about the condition of the property. But then, the detail, or like the contractors think it's really detailed, inspector really detailed. What the buyer is observing is not as detailed as, they're literally going through the house and noting things and seeing things. They may see a water stain on the ceiling in one of the bedrooms. They say, I need information about that. What's going on with that? So the buyer's going to observe. And from that observation, they're getting information about the condition of the property, things they may want to have addressed. Now, often when they get that, they may get that information even before an inspection is done. At first, we're seeing the property. They may have noted things, and they want to make sure that they talk to their inspectors. They go, by the way, we noticed this. Is that something that you've taken a look at? And can you explain to us what that is, what you found out there? You were good. Now, the agent side is a little tricky. It's absolutely okay based on your experiences for you to notice something and saying, okay, I noticed that. What you're not going to say is, yeah, I see those hairline cracks. You've got a foundation problem. You're not going to say that. You're not a foundation expert. What you're going to say is, okay, this tells me that you probably should have a foundation company or a structural engineer come out, take a look at this, because it's something that may cause concern. But you're not going to make a factual statement because you don't have that authority under your real estate license. So when you observe something, what you're really doing is you're telling your buyer, yeah, here's something that you may want to research a little bit further. There's some interesting things that happen. I know you run into a couple of them. If you've got a house in which you've got, maybe area rugs or something like that in the den. Or maybe you've got wall-to-wall carpeting and you've got furniture and couches and stuff like that around. One of the things that we know, if they've lived there for a while, when they move that rug, there's going to be something underneath it. When they move their furniture, there's going to be something underneath it. When the buyer goes to the house after closing, if this is the first time they've seen the house vacant, it'll be different. There's going to be things. Now, all these things you do for your client, you're making the judgment call about how they process information, how they deal with it. Some of them you have to be careful Because if you keep pointing out one more thing, one more thing, one more thing, you get all paranoid and it overwhelms them and they can't make any decisions. Or even worse, they say use the one creating the problem. Nobody else saw that as a problem and you sure saw why. Yeah, I'll go find an agent that doesn't create all those problems, so. But, you know, you will over time, based on your experiences, you'll say, well, I never thought about that before. But, you know, it says hardwood floor, but it turns out it's only around the edge and in the carpet underneath you just got, you know, regular flooring underneath. You don't have full hardwood. And once you've had that experience, next time you'll be a little more careful in asking questions and determining, you know, what was really happening. But these four things in the step one, this is all obtaining information. So the buyer is now beginning to have information, is this property in a condition that's going to meet my needs, both in using it and value of it, or I'm going to have a lot of things done to it, you know, to make it work. Now, as you gather that information, the second step here is you're going to pull all that information together. Do you have any sense, Marcia, of how agents are pulling the information together to begin to help a buyer work?
On repairs?
Yeah.
I think most of the time, what I see is that they depend on the inspection. Sometimes I think they might look at the seller's disclosure, but I think the majority of it is definitely the inspection report. And I forgot to mention, but when you have the seller, if the seller's had an inspection before and the buyer wants a copy of the inspection because they may not do their own, they may just take that inspection. We have a form for that too.
Yeah, we do.
Because they don't have any recourse with that inspector. It wasn't someone they hired personally. They can't go back later and say, you missed this or you missed that. It's, you know, something that we try not to encourage, but if they want to see it, you make sure that you have them sign that form first before you give them a
Yeah.
copy, right?
And Marcia's right. The tendency is, right, make note of
I know,
that.
right?
That most of them, they're gonna rely on what's in the inspection report, more so than seller disclosure notice. However, because of what I do in the business, when I see the complaints and also and so forth, what happens is, shows up in the lawsuit, is there's a difference in what's in the seller disclosure and what showed up in the inspection. And so the question of the buyer is, we think the seller knew this and failed to disclose it. Because the inspectors are notorious for that. I said, oh yeah, this has been here for a long time. There's no way they couldn't have known about this, whatever this is. So while the buyer will tend to rely on the inspection report, they should also look at the seller disclosure notice to make sure that there's not something in the inspection report that probably should have been in the seller disclosure notice. Because the natural question a buyer is going to ask is, wow, this is what our inspector found. I don't see you talking about in the inspection report. And so the buyer is reasonably going to ask the seller, so were you just not aware of this? Just not know about it? Did you conveniently forget it? Or you just lied to us? Now, this comes down to an understanding. We've all got a different set of experiences with how we live in houses. Different people live in a house. I mean, you got a family who's lived there for 20 years and they've raised their kids. They've got a more intimate experience with their house, the condition of it, than someone else. Back when I was doing production years ago, I had the buyer and the seller was a salesman, and he would leave Sunday night or Monday morning, come back Friday night or Saturday morning, and he had a person who took care of his house. His experience with his house was minimal because he wasn't there every day. And so when he was completing seller disclosure notice, it was pretty minimal information. And when he didn't include something, it wasn't because he was lying, he just wasn't aware of it. He wasn't there every day. So we've got to have some sense of what's going on with the seller and how they're living in a house as whether or not that's the case. But as you pull together this condition information, one, you're relying on the information you got in step one, and then you're going to find out, got this information, what I'm going to do is I'm moving to step three. This is where you prioritize. Hello, Scott Scribner, royalty in the house.
Sorry, I'm late.
Well, that's your, hey, back in the back, there's paperwork, back on the thing where the sign-in sheet is, where you were gonna sign it.
Where?
He's actually early because he's gonna be here on the 16th. We have the agent's hotline. Talk to us. Right?
I'll be here.
Yes, you will. So, yeah, get that paperwork. So we're on step 3 now. Now, Marcia, how do you see agents helping the buyers prioritize? They've got information about the condition of the property, and they're gonna prioritize so they can move forward and have some strategy for repairs. How do you see them prioritize?
When I was in production, what I would do is I would tell the buyers, you sort of prepare the buyers before the inspection and make sure they understand that this is gonna be something where, you know, the pull chain on the fan is not to their liking, they're not gonna ask for that. You know, it's not gonna be what I would consider a frivolous ask, that it needs to be something that is safety related, is how I always told my people. That we would look and see things that pertain to the major systems of the home. So if it was something that was just cosmetic and they didn't like it, that really wasn't something, now you can't tell your people, you can't ask for it because you have to do what they tell you, but at the same time, you know, you sort of prepare them, is how you prepare them is how they will respond, right?
So Scott, when you've got a buyer and we're almost third step here, and you've got a buyer who's obtained information, self-disclosure, other things, and now they're going to prioritize so they can move forward and do some strategy for negotiating. How do you help your client prioritize moving forward and requesting for repairs?
Well, just sort of tagging on to what Marcia says, I think one of the lessons that I learned early on is if you empower your client and you make them feel like they're always in control of the process, then that alleviates a lot of issues. And so one of the first things we talk about is kind of like Marcia says, basically, you're having this inspection, you want to make sure you want to move forward with the house. Now, they're always going to find things, always. So the question is, what's reasonable to ask a seller to do? And what are they willing to do? And what's important to you? In other words, what would prevent you from buying this house? But one of the things I've always tried to do is I always try to say, but it's always, just remember, it's always your decision. So we're here to offer you thoughts and advice, but you're the one that makes the final decision. And I always feel like when you tell them that, then
They feel in control, don't
they
they?
feel in control.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times, then they wind up not being as picky, but they know they can be.
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah.
Good enough. Sally, what do you do?
I prepare mentally that this person has to point out every single thing in the house, like even if a light switch doesn't turn on, you know, because Tractor fires them too. And I tell them we need to focus mostly on health and safety hazards, things, and the major systems of the house, which is the roof, the plumbing, the HVAC, and the foundation. Those are extremely expensive. You know, usually if there's any.
Yeah.
So those would be their first priorities, and don't get all hung up on a dripping faucet or some, you know.
Yeah, so you're helping them
Some-
prioritize a little bit as you're working through it. And like, it's Scott, I'm talking about Marcia, but they're the decision maker.
Yeah.
We're providing them with some good information. Joe, what are you doing?
I basically tell them to focus on the 5 major components of the home. And then look at the cosmetic or stuff that is not as major to handle. And I always explain to them that, you know, we'll make the amendment with a list that they wanna address. But keep in mind that the seller doesn't have to do any repairs. Okay, they can say, make it or leave it, or they can say, we'll do these instead of this. Or we can say, no, you know what, we won't mess with it, we'll just give you monetary consideration in lieu of repairs. So I make them aware that that's good, they could be, they're gonna be facing, you know, one of those 3.
Yeah. Larry, what do you find? What do you do?
Whatever Marcia tells me.
I understand it's smart of you to do that.
Focus on the 5 main systems, and anything else that's a safety issue. And tell them cosmetic issues are low on the priority list.
Okay, now, one of the things on what I've just gotten from the four of you, five of you, is we've got negotiation notes later in this that talks about other factors that come into play as they prioritize, one, what is important to them as they work through the process. And one of the things that we need for them to, there's a question we always, you see a little later, need for them to ask. How would I like to own the house? What kind of condition does it need to be in for me to be okay owning it, whether I'm gonna live in it or whether I'm gonna rent it out, whether I'm gonna flip it, what kind, because sometimes you're negotiating repairs and you're getting towards the end of an option period and you haven't worked it out. And so we've got to tell the buyers, okay, you've got to make the decision right now. If the seller is moving forward, not going to do anything because they don't have to, are you still willing to buy the house? Is it still something that works for you? And they've got to do that early on. As they gain information, as they prioritize, they're prioritizing with that end thought that at some point in time, I've got to make the decision, am I willing to live with this or not? So we're, Cynthia, we're there on the first page, step 3, where we're talking about prioritizing, helping the buyer do that. Because we are, remember that big picture that we've got as agents, we're helping them work through it. And you're making judgment calls all the way through the process on your client. What kind of client do you have? You have a client who's very anal, who's very detail oriented, very, whatever. You may have a client who just is overwhelmed and says, I don't know what to do. I trust you. I'll trust you, whatever you think. And that's a challenge because we can't be the decision makers, but at the same time, we've got to flex to them, to their personality, how they do things. Some people who are incredibly analytical. When they ask a question to someone and that someone gives an immediate answer, they don't trust them. There's no way you could have had an answer for that. You didn't think through it hard enough. You weren't analytical enough. See Marsha pointing at Larry.
About that.
And so you've got to be able to work. So when you're helping them to prioritize, you're helping them think about something and develop a strategy towards an end game. You've got that in mind. They don't yet know. They say, yeah, okay, we've done inspection. We're going to ask for repairs. And they don't understand all the pieces of this like you do. And that's what's outlined in these 6 steps as you go through it. Did you have a follow-up, Scott?
Oh, I guess just to reiterate the point, I think it's always good to try to telegraph before the inspection, even when you're going through the offer with it. Okay, you're going to have an option period. Now, that's an opportunity for you to have an inspection done. And the purpose of that inspection is for you to determine whether you want to buy that house or not. And so again, by telegraphing, okay, here's really what it's for. It's not, you're not doing it just to have a bunch of more negotiation. You're doing it to decide if you want to buy the house. And I think if you do that, that sort of sets the tone. Maybe that helps set the tone that, okay, that's right, I'm doing this. Now they're going to find things, but I'm really deciding, do I want to buy this house?
Yeah, exactly. So within all the things that you guys have talked about, as we are prioritizing the information, look at these 4 steps here, all come into play. You're aware of them, you think about them, here's my think about them. We talked about the safety issue, we talked about the function, we talked about the 5 functions. Is this something that's important in dealing with the actual function of a house? Is it a major item? Is it a roof? Is it a foundation, electrical, air conditioning, plumbing? Is it something that's at that level? So that's an importance. That's one of the things that helps us prioritize. The other is the cost. And we'll see later as we look at negotiation, part of this depends on the kind of deal the buyer got. If the buyer paid way above list price, then he's going to say, at this price, I expect some stuff. If he got a heck of a deal way below list price, not only does the buyer say, well, maybe I can live with a few things as long as it's not one of the big items, because the seller is not going to expect it. We'll see in negotiation notes a little bit how that works out. So you can look at the cost and see what kind of trade-off you can do based on what the cost is. And then you're going to see what kind of a lender and insurance requirements are there that may impact. If you've got some lender issues there, then that's certainly going to be involved as a buyer prioritizes, works through that. And we'll talk a little bit about when the buyer says, okay, there's some roof issues here, seller, so you've got to have an insurance adjuster comes out, you got to file a claim, with the insurance company, go through that process. And that may be a prioritize. How you do that and the language of doing that, we're going to talk about. And then based on the timing of the repairs. One of the things we hear from sellers is that, you know what? I was right on top of this. I did exactly what I was asked to do. I did the repairs right away. They did it early on in the transaction and the buyer flaked on them, and they're really happy because they did repairs that they feel like may not be true, but feel like I just did for this buyer and this buyer's going away. So I've wasted some money that I didn't need to spend for the next buyer. And so when you get into a situation where you're dealing with the timing of repairs, depending on the nature of the repair, the seller may have a lot of latitude on when he's going to do it. As long as in fact, he does follow paragraph 70, dealing with, in fact, that he's got to do these prior to closing and that kind of situation, unless we work something out otherwise. So the timing of that, all those things come into play as you're helping your buyer strategize and go through the process and prioritize how these are going to be done. Now, step 4, this is big for you, the agent, is you're going to create a strategy for the request for repairs. When you look at what's going on here and develop this strategy, you're going to have a sense of what's going on. One of the things that I've heard mentioned a couple of times that you realize, and buyers don't always, seller doesn't have to do anything. Seller doesn't have to do any repair. Now, the consequence may be our termination contract, and may have a right to terminate. But buyer needs to understand seller doesn't have to do anything. You work through the process. And so when they're developing a strategy, they have to determine, here's a strategy where I can get these things done that I want to get done. Recognizing that my only real leverage with the seller is that I can terminate a contract. So my only real leverage is I hope the seller wants to sell me the property. I hope that my deal is good enough. The seller wants to do this deal, work through that process. So I think as you help them go through and strategize, but the buyer needs to decide what has to happen with this property to meet the requirements, however it is I'm going to own the property, live in there, rent it out, whatever I'm going to do, what has to happen. And what has to happen to make it worth what I'm paying for. Because if you're buying a property that's clearly an investor property, it's in terrible shape, and you're buying it because you're going to fix it and flip it and all that kind of stuff, it'd be at a whole different price. We see this happen a lot with roofs. Where a buyer goes through the process and he says, you got to put a new roof on. You might as well do it for me. If you don't have to do it, if you don't do it for me, you got to do it with the next buyer. So it's, no, it's not true. You're buying this property with a 20-year-old roof. If you want a new roof, it's going to be a different price. And a good listing agent, a good seller understands that. And so when a buyer goes through the process and he says, yeah, okay, do this and shit, but no, you don't have to. And so you need to work through that process of strategizing. And understand, we see it later when we talk about price adjustments, work through that. How it's important for you to help advise them as they go through the process. And really try to determine what it is they can get that seller to go along with based on what the seller agreed to in the transaction, the contract. What did the seller agree to fix and what did the seller expect? Most sellers, it's what I see, and tell me if I'm entirely wrong here. Most sellers have been educated by their, I saw that smart. Most sellers have been educated by their listing agent. Buyer's going to do an inspection, expect a request for repairs. That's just what's going to happen. So most sellers are prepared to do something. Although many times the seller will accept an offer and say, at this price, I'm not doing anything. Get it? In fact, some of them will require their agent to put in paragraph 11. This is as is, where it is, I'm not doing that. That's it. Well, you don't have to, but I want to. And on one hand, it's not a bad deal because sometimes a buyer, they go through, they've got the option fee, they've got the inspection costs, and go through the process. And then they find out the seller's not going to do anything. He says, you know what? It'd be nice to have known that right up front before I spent all this money on this stuff. I'd like to have known that you weren't going to do anything. Even though the buyer's agent said, he doesn't have to. Yeah, but they expect to do something, don't they? And that is the norm, isn't it? mean, that's the expectation. That's how we educate sellers. Say, here's what's gonna happen. And be prepared for it as you work through the process. Is that what you see?
It is, but I think also the seller's perspective can change. So if a seller gets a backup offer, for instance, and it's a much better offer than what they have, you know, they don't really have rights of termination unless the earnest money wasn't delivered on
Yeah.
time. So it may be their strategy to just flat out say, I'm not gonna repair anything, hoping that that first buyer will terminate so that they
Yeah.
can take the better offer. They may not have started out that way thinking, you know, I'm not gonna do anything, but it's just a strategy they will
Yeah.
use.
But their situation may have changed. And remember, no obligation of the seller. Tell the first buyer that you're in a backup contract. So the seller may keep that quiet until they decide that it's going to be valuable in their negotiation with the first buyer. For them to know, hey, you know what, I got a deal better than yours anyway, so I'm not doing anything, or here's what we'll do. And if you'll raise the price, when we work through this process, we'll work with you. Otherwise, have a nice day. Next, you gotta move through the process. So that's important.
How about the new build?
What?
A new build.
What about a new build? What's your question on new build?
So some of the builder, people do the inspection report. And then some, some of the builder, their construction team's really bad. Then some of the sensor, the inspection report, they need to fix a lot of things. And then we ask for the builder sales or their construction team manager. They did not respond.
Yeah. It's a challenging situation. And what she's talking about is on a new build situation. And you've got some significantly different challenges. One, it's generally not going to be a Trek contract. And so you cannot advise your client on the terms of that builder contract. Not a Trek contract. They've got to talk to an attorney or go through some other process. And we have far less control over the seller situation in a new build, because they've got their agenda, they've got their process, they've got their corporate environment as they go through, deal with all that. Sometimes it's very hard to get them to do anything, work through it. There are some builders who won't even allow a third-party inspection. So there are things in the contract that address and deal with what your buyers has a right to do. The two riskiest transactions that we do for our buyers, one are builders, the other when the seller's institutional sales. Those two, because we have less control, they're making corporate decisions, and it's hard to get them doing things. And sometimes, like in your case, you can't get anybody to talk to you. Okay, any communication. And remember, they have no real obligations to you or the buyer or anybody. So they're going to do what they're going to do. And especially, we saw this a lot last year when prices were accelerating so much. If your deal wasn't going to work out, they say, we're happy, go away, here's your money back, have a nice day.
Yeah, they were looking for reason.
Oh, to
Kill the deal.
Yeah. So it is harder. So you just need to be prepared dealing with a new home situation to work harder. All the nice little normal strategy steps that we go through in a regular seller kind of thing, just not there. So it's going to be harder work. It's going to be riskier, be tougher for your buyer. Now, many buyers can get a really good deal on a builder situation. They want to be in that nice new and all that kind of stuff and whatever. They're almost certainly going to be in a manager HOA, and they're going to deal with all those issues. But some buyers, say, one of our agents had a buyer, and she wanted a new home. She didn't want a pre-owned. And she said, because I want a house, where nobody's ever used the bathroom, ever used the commode. Good luck. I hope you don't go out to the house while it's being built and see what I'm trying to do. That stuff. That stuff ends up in that tub and everybody's got their little property. So yeah, that strategy is you've got to be pulling in so much information as an agent to help your client with the strategy, what's going on the other side, what's happening. One of the things that you have to do with new builds is find out what the hierarchy is when you can't get this person to do anything, or you go there. We have so little control on a new build situation.
We just talk about new build.
She go, well, good, go talk to him, tell him tell them, get this done right away.
Right.
Your broker says it's gotta get done.
And that we're gonna all call him.
Now,
Yeah, we blame you a lot.
Yeah.
and you know what? And I appreciate that. That's job security, so that's good.
Well, and you too, Marcia, we blame you too.
Thank you. I
I
know
would
we
say
left out, so thank you.
Bob and Marcia.
Now, step 5 could be an entire book. We're still on page 1 there. You got the information back in the back there, Paula.
Yes.
We've talked about this in a number of classes. And these are the concepts that go behind the language you're going to use. It's not possible for me to overstate the importance that the language needs to meet these concepts. I mean, I could say it till I'm blue in the face about it. Let me hear that one more time, and you still get it wrong. You know, because one of the realities is, if you're experienced, you've been through this a few times, and you know, Bob was really right. I shouldn't have written it like that. And I screwed up on that. But until you do it a few times, you say, wow, I'm not sure I really understand that. But you know, it's huge. People misunderstand each other. You go, you have paperwork in the back there. There you go. When I sometimes go through and get like a breakfast sandwich, I like it with crispy bacon. How I say that is important. If I say I like extra crispy bacon, they may think I'm asking for more bacon. If I say I like my bacon really crispy, they understand what that means. When you're driving down the freeway and there's a car kind of up there, just a little bit in front of you right there, and they turn their right turn signal on. Do you think they're going to turn over here, or are they asking permission to turn into your lane? What do you think?
They're telling you what they're gonna do.
Okay, maybe I was listening to radio one day, and these two guys had totally opposite. One of them says, if I'm there next to you and I put my signal on, you better get out of the way because I'm coming. I said, no. In my opinion, what you've done is made a request. You say, I'd like to come over to your lane and here's the signal. Would you let me do it? So people look at the exact same thing and have totally different views about what it means. We've got the same thing here. We had a challenge and it cost our agent some money and dealt with windows. And we represented the buyer. And the buyer wanted a request and he wanted windows replaced. That's pretty simple, except you got to understand what that means. What's a window? And the seller thought just the glass pane. That's all we need, because some of them were fogged over and said, we just need to put some of those in there, ain't good. And the buyer wanted the whole thing. Oh, framing, everything.
Big difference.
Big difference. And yet you say something like that, you go, wow. So your language has to be so clear and specific. The phrase is, don't write it so it can be understood. Write it so it cannot be misunderstood. Think about it from that perspective as you work through it. Because remember, one of your obligations is that the language that goes in a repair amendment has to be language that before it becomes real, before your client signs off on it, you need to make sure that your client understands what you're asking. You need to make sure the other side is going to understand what the buyer is asking. Remember, it doesn't matter who originated the language, both agents are responsible for it. Correct, will hold both agents responsible for what ends up there, regardless of who originated it. They work through the process. So very clear and specific language. You know, and it gets into the other things here. When you ask, for example, and a simple example is HVAC repair, you know, on a regular basis. And something is shown up in the inspection report, and the inspector has checked that last box back there and maybe made some comments on it. And so the buyer is saying to the seller, what's a great language that they like to use over and over again? That's wrong. Repair, yeah, that at the HVAC is to be evaluated, inspected, and repaired or replaced as needed. Now, right here, number 2, we've got to decide, be here, who's making the decision on what happens? The buyer just gave the decision over to the seller. Or to some contractor the seller hires. Is that what the buyer meant to do? Almost certainly not. So the buyer has to say, okay, here is specifically what needs to be done. Maybe we've got a leak in the pressure, maybe we've got something that's going through the process, maybe it's more than just temperature differentials. The buyer says, here is the problem. And this is specifically what needs to be done. And the buyer says, and this is the company that needs to do it. Now, we'll let the seller control the cost to whatever degree we need to. But the buyer is one who needs to decide, here's the person who's going to make the decision. Is this going to be repaired or replaced? If it's the buyer's own company, they should feel a little bit more comfortable that whoever they have do it is going to follow what the buyer wants to have done. If you give that decision making over to the other side, buyer as Richard said, hey, yeah, whatever you think is okay with me. I'm fine with that. Is that what the buyer really wants? Is that what the buyer wants?
I don't know. Ask the buyer.
Huh?
You have to
You
ask.
gotta
the
ask
buyer.
me.
I think this is one of the most difficult parts of the amendment repair request of all, is trying to figure out the right way to say something that encompasses everything. Because it never fails that you might write it down and look at it, and then 10 minutes later, read it again, and it's totally different than what you thought. And the other side definitely doesn't understand what you're trying to say. Roofs, HVAC, those are really hard when people call and ask for verbiage on that, because it's just difficult.
Yeah, it is complicated because if you're, remember, from the buyer's perspective, you're right. Okay, they want ABC company to do the inspection, and then based on that, ABC company says, yeah, you need to replace the system. Well, so if you go to the seller and say, we want the system replaced by ABC company, then the seller, then they have to decide, okay, do we trust what they said? Or a lot of times, they're gonna have their own person come out before, and that's what they should do, before they agree to it. I want to have someone else come out and check it too. If they say it needs to be replaced, then okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If they say no, you just need to replace the Johnson rod or whatever.
It's a negotiation, isn't it?
Exactly. But that's where it can kind of get stretched out. But sometimes it does. You have to.
So HVAC is a good example. The buyer's process should be 2 steps. One, their company does the evaluation, does the inspection, provides the buyer information. Based on that information, the buyer then provides a request to the seller. Here's what our AC company has said, here's what they recommend. Because up front, when the inspector, track inspector just said, here's something I had. We don't really know enough yet to say, here's what really needs to be done. If it's your own company doing it, the buyer can maybe get away a little bit with evaluate, but you still need to have them evaluate, determine that HVAC company's got to come back with something to the buyer. So buyer should make some good sense, because if it's a lot of money, if the buyer says, yeah, we got to have a new $15,000 system, we have got a whole new negotiation, because we've got to really work with the seller and getting things done that the seller may or may not have anticipated. Now, the seller knew that they've got a 20-year-old HVAC system. So, we can just get by with this thing, not having to replace the whole thing one more summer, we're in great shape. Or the seller says, it's working just fine, everything's good, and whatever. And it's unusual, but one of our challenges with track inspectors, and there's some good ones out there that do this, is they say, system is operating as intended. And then they'll make a little comment, but it's 20 years old, and we'll probably any day now. I mean, they'll sometimes inspectors will make comments about future events, which they should never do. But they do. Now your buyer is dealing with that thing, says, wow, right now it's working today, but there's this inspector saying, good luck next month. Good luck getting through this summer, something like that. Now the buyer is predisposed that, well, we got to negotiate something there.
The fact that if you have a 25-year-old furnace, chances are it is at the end of its useful life.
Oh, yeah.
So
Sure.
That's where.
So here's the question now, if the seller knew that and they priced the property accordingly. ourselves is, most people don't look at the value of these things point by point by point. And so even though it's a 20-year-old system, it still works out fine, everything is good. We're gonna move forward on this basis until some buyer says, whoa. Happy to pay a good price for the property, but not with something that's major element that's gonna get ready to go at any point in time. So you gotta be able to work through and deal with that.
One of the things we talk to our clients about, like buyers, is if they're, if they agree to go forward, let's say they ask the seller to replace it. Seller says, no, we just have to advise our buyer, okay, yeah, it is working, but you just gonna have to put a place marker and know that within some period of time, you're gonna have to replace this furnace.
You
So
have a major expense there, so you have to deal with it.
That's
make
pretty
sure that
awesome.
they mentally are, hey, I'm filing this in the bottom way.
That's true with a lot of different things, the water heater is 20 years old, it works great and nobody's had any complaints. Dishwasher, is on its last leg too, and I think it's important that you also explain to your buyers that as soon as they close and fund on the house, to expect things to fall apart.
Sure.
Because it happens all the time and then they get all bent out of shape and upset because, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't my inspector catch this? Why didn't you have me ask for this to be repaired? And we don't know, but.
I mean, an 8-year-old furnace can go out tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's not unreasonable for a buyer to think that, by the way. But you need to educate them. You need to educate buyer says, these things happen any and all time. I mean, an 8-year-old, whatever. Because everybody knows they don't make them like they used to. But you need to educate them as much as you can. And a lot of what's going to happen is how they feel about the information they got from Trek, from seller disclosure, seller, if they trust all that. And if their immediate response is not, oh my gosh, everybody lied to me, and including my own agent, because he didn't make sure that I understood all this stuff. Because you've got a balancing act here. If you go too far in helping your buyer understand, here's the deal. 20-year-old system, 20-year-old, and they sit there and go, wow, man, and it'll overwhelm them. They can't make any decisions. But on the other hand, you've got to educate them on, here's the deal with the house. It's not a new house and things will happen. You take on that ownership, you just have to work through that, deal with it. So you got out of the way of the camera. I didn't know whether the camera was, whether they were getting the back of your head follower or not. So are we still doing okay out there, Zoomers? Don't be quiet. We good?
Yes, we're good.
Good.
Good. So be sure to remind me if people have questions in here or make comments and I don't make sure you can hear them, let me know so we can make sure that you're as involved as you can be considering you're virtual. We'll work through that. So do y'all have some comments on some stuff we just talked about with the systems and whatever? Do you want to follow up on this question?
Another point to make that it's really important to educate your clients, whether you have buyer or seller, on everything all the time. Larry Levine had a situation where he had the listing and the buyer's agent, if I recall, in the repair request, asked the seller to have somebody come out, like, you know what I'm talking about?
I have no idea which.
To further tell if there was anything wrong. It was either foundation
yeah.
or, well, okay, go ahead.
The buyer's agent said seller to have such and such company come out to inspect if there's anything wrong and then fix anything that's wrong. We pretty much said that's your job.
Yeah, they weren't taking that extra step, the buyer side was not taking that extra step in doing their due diligence. They were just putting in the repair request that the seller needed to take care of that. The seller needed to call the electrician or the foundation people and have them come out, perform, and
They're
tell them
passing
what
the
was wrong.
buck there. Probably not a good situation for a buyer to leave the decision making up to someone else.
And that may be a situation where the agent didn't want to deal with it either.
Sure. Oh,
At least the agent, like, well, okay.
It's got,
Bob, it's Laura. That unfortunately happens way more often than I wish it did.
really? Okay.
the agent lived in Prosper and the house was in Plano and she didn't want to have to drive back and forth.
Oh, yeah. Well, sure. Cynthia, you had something?
So in the situation that you just described with the buyer requesting a certain vendor, how do you cap the money if you're representing the seller? You say not to exceed.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So Cynthia's question is when the buyer chooses a company to do whatever, and they recognize the seller's concern, first, the seller should be happy with that. If a buyer chooses the company, the seller should be happy with that. Because the buyer's not gonna be able to fuss at what was done, how it was done, because it was the buyer's own company.
It's his fault.
What the seller wants to do is control the cost. And so you can either have a conversation ahead of time and with the listing agent, said, okay, here's what we're gonna do. Do you want us to go ahead and go through the process, and cap the cost or something like that? Or do you have some number? It's hard to do right up front because you don't have that additional information yet from the HVAC company. Once you have that, you're in a better position. Right, because what you'll do then is you'll provide to the seller that report from the HVAC company. Saying, here's what it is, here's what's required to be done, and here's their estimate of what it's gonna cost. Then the seller say, okay, we'll do this thing from your company. And here's all we're gonna do. We're not gonna pay for the whole thing, but we'll do this, and now you're at a negotiation.
Follow up to that, wouldn't it be just easier for the seller to contribute like kinds of the buyer's closing costs?
It could be, and one of the points we have a negotiating point here is talking about money in lieu of repairs and how we might deal with that. And some of the adjustments may be to sales price, depending on whether it's cash or financing or how much down, that type of thing. And in fact, we will talk about the fact that for many lenders, anything that we can do to keep away from repairs and deal with the money issue is generally viewed by the lender as a better thing. Because they don't really want to talk about repairs. So, depending on the nature of it, if you've got a really good motivated seller, particularly even in a cash transaction, it's really easy for the seller to do an adjustment in sales price. Because in a cash transaction, all adjusted sales price is dollar for dollar on both sides. And so that can be an easy thing. One of the concepts on these kinds of things, by the way, we're going to make adjustments to sales price or whatever it is based on some major repair. Maybe not even a major repair. What we do need to recognize is that buyers will always discount the value of property by more than what it takes to fix the problem. So the reality is if it's going to take, a certain amount of money to fix it. We had a case back in the 70s. There was an area of East Dallas that was in that area, it was about 50-50 for houses that had been converted to central heat and air, as opposed to the one who had window units. And when you looked at those houses, you turn it up or down.
Yes.
Hell, are you hot?
Yes.
Jeez. And what we discovered is it cost about $10,000 to make that conversion. And then buyers would discount the properties by more than that because of the hassle factor. That we'd rather pay more for a house that it's already taken care of. So we don't have to mess with the hassle. So we've got to keep in mind, depending on the nature of what it is, what's going to be taken, how much of a hassle it's going to be, how much you're going to work out. And it may be money in lieu of, maybe work out. Many times a buyer may say, you know what, we're contractors, we do the work, we've got people like that. Some of the people that Cynthia works with, for example, we can do this a lot cheaper and a lot better than what the seller would do or what his contractor. So let's just make some money adjustments here and just move forward. And presuming it's not a lender required repair, a lot of flexibility there. And the agent can help them negotiate, work through that. So in B, we were talking about who's going to do it, who's going to decide that. And C, when will it be completed? Now, this is where you get into title companies and lenders, and depending on the nature of repair, many roofing companies, good roofing companies, will be paid at closing. And so they'll be in a position where they can go ahead and do the repair prior to closing. And the lender is happy with that because a roof often is a lender required repair. Or you may be dealing with an insurance company and working the adjustment with an insurance adjuster. And so when you work through that process, sometimes the timing of that works well. This gets back into the seller situation. Seller says, if I'm gonna pay for this, and I'm only doing it for this buyer, I want to wait as far into the transaction before I commit to doing it. Because I'm not sure how good I feel about this transaction. It's kind of one of those things that, it might be okay, might not be okay. So the seller may want to wait later in the deal. Many times the seller has a situation where frankly, they've got to pay for it out of the sales proceeds. They can't do it before. They just don't have the money to be able to improve that, do it. I understand that you see deal with some of that. Certainly when the property management of the sellers go through that process. But the timing of that becomes, pretty important relating to the closing date. And then the cost, who pays for it and when. Now, in the contract, the seller is obligated to complete repairs. That's in the language, paragraph 17 of the contract. But it's certainly a negotiating point because, if the buyer and seller have entered into this contract at a certain price, this is where that factor comes into play. Is it a really good deal for the buyer or a really good deal for the seller? Is it a really good deal for both of them? Agents were able to help negotiate a really good thing. Is it weighed really very much in favor of the buyer? And if that's the case, in going through the process, the seller is going to be more reluctant to do some repairs because they'll keep thinking, this buyer got a heck of a deal. This price, I can do anything. So as you work through it, when you look at the cost, the buyer has to determine how much it is going to impact the negotiation. This is where as much as we can learn about the seller and their circumstances, is going to be really important. We know we've got a really tough situation from the seller's perspective, what they can even be able to do. That's going to impact on the negotiations, especially when you're in an estate situation and you've got siblings who are not willing to pay a penny for anything. Work through that, and you've got to deal with that. Any comments or follow-ups on dealing with that? Yes, ma'am.
Are you gonna cover what happens if the seller agrees to make the repairs, but the company, it can't be completed prior to closing?
Yeah, that gets into the timing of repairs related to the closing date. And
Especially like hail or something like that.
and this primarily deals with major issues like roofing, foundation, occasionally HVAC. And if we've got the buyer and it's not the seller's fault, the seller said, yeah, we agreed to do it, we agreed to pay for it. And maybe it's an insurance adjustment kind of situation. If the title company and the lender are okay with escrowing funds, they'll escrow funds at closing money out of the sales proceeds. And it'll be for a fairly limited time frame, maybe 2 weeks. Occasionally I see 30 days, but not very often. And so what's going to happen is the title company is going to literally escrow funds, hold money from the sales proceeds, and it's going to be made payable to a specific contractor to do that. Now, many title companies will do this. I don't know any title companies that like to do it. It's not a favorite thing of theirs.
A lot of them won't do it.
A lot of them want to. You're exactly right. When I was talking to Austin about this at Legacy Title, he said, well, that's the last resort thing. If there's any way we can keep from doing that, we don't want to do it. Because it's a challenge. But it can be done. The lender's going to have to be okay with the fact that here's a major repair that's not going to really be done until after closing. Lender's going to have to work with that. And the title company's going to have to build it. It's a big risk for the buyer. Even though money is set aside for this contractor, things happen. Weather happens, contractor goes out of business, contractor can't quite get to it. He's got really busy because of all the storms, stuff like that. He's busy, and he can't get it done within the time frame. There's a lot of risk for the buyer. So the buyer needs to understand, if you agree to do this, what you've essentially done is you've agreed to take this property in this condition, you close on it. If what you want to have done gets done after closing, buy a lottery ticket because you're a lucky person.
Is that situation, can we postpone the closing?
Yeah, that's our preference.
That's.
Delay the closing, that's our preference, absolutely. We don't want our buyer to close, just like we don't want our seller to do a buyer's temporary residential lease. We will say, let's do a closing, let's delay the closing, let's do that. That's by far the better thing to do, and that's what we'll always recommend as you go through it. But sometimes you just have that situation. Sometimes we had a lot last year with supply chains where they just didn't have the material, didn't have the equipment as you work through that. And then buyer's got to make a decision, seller's got to make a decision. It's less of a problem for the seller because it's not money out of their pocket, it's money that comes from sales proceeds, closing. So it's not a big deal for them. You got to have a title company that'll do it. You got to have a lender who'll say, yeah, we're okay with that. And even a cash transaction, still you have to have, title company to work through it. But it's the timing is a challenge, and we have to look at what we're going to recommend to our client and make sure this is one of those cases where I'd like to overstate the risk to the buyer. Here's your buyer. I mean, we've had companies where here's the money, they got paid the money, or they got paid half the money, and they're gone. We never hear from them again. And that happens. You just have to deal with it. So there's a big risk. Step 6. Follow up re-inspection to confirm repairs. I should have, in A, the must word should have been capitalized, underlined, and in bold print. We have no latitude. Everybody good with me on page 2 here, step 6? We have no latitude here. There can never be a situation in which you do not advise the buyer, your buyer client, to do a re-inspection. They don't have to do one. You have to advise them in writing, such as an email, get them to acknowledge it. You have to do it. Now, I own this. I recognize this because I have had the experiences in both lawsuits and threat complaints and demand letters where they blamed us for not making sure that the property was in the condition it was supposed to be in before they closed. So, well, you should have told us. And the reality is, well, I did that, but the agent didn't do it in writing. We had no acknowledgments that we advised them. And they blamed us. So you've got to do this. You just have to do this. And you have to, and it's more than just, hey, here's the thing you got to do. And it's a CYA for us, you got to do this. You've got to help them understand the importance of it. I mean, they've negotiated repairs, and many repairs, you can't walk through the house and see that it's been done. So you've got to say, you've got to do a re-inspection. So you need to be working with inspectors and people who can go do those things. And is generally going to be an additional charge. What do you guys see in charge price for a re-inspection? Seeing $100, something like that? Are you seeing some inspectors not doing anything at all, or?
Some will go out and just, if it's not complicated, they'll just fit it in their schedule. I'd say sometimes like $100.
Yeah.
If it's easy.
If it's reasonable, yeah. Because you've got, you foundation issues, you gotta have a foundation person, same thing, foundation roofers, electrical, plumbing, those things have to be done, by somebody who can do that. So you've got to tell them to do it. You've got to explain to them, here's why that's important. Here's the deal. Now, I do have in your package is the buyer's walkthrough confirmation acceptance form. That's about 3 pages over. That's a great form. You should always use it. That should be in your package, buyer or seller. Making any progress there, young lady, with our builder person? Any progress at all?
He say it's off date. And he vacation again. I need to wait for he come back.
You're gonna have to call the XP. Okay, so this is great because it talks about inspections, re-inspections. What we got here is documentation. And we've got our buyer sign off on this, seller, going through the process. Yeah, okay. This is good for the buyer and the seller. And we've gone through that process, and it makes the buyer. So they're telling us, yeah, I didn't have it re-inspected. I didn't have it inspected. I didn't, That's interesting. I didn't think about that just now. If the buyer doesn't do an inspection, we've got a form. We don't have a form for if they don't do a re-inspection. I mean, this is, yeah, that's good. But you got to do that. So that's a good form that you ought to have in your package. Now, D, it's not you. You can't do this. Oh, it's just, it's easy, you can see it, you can spot it, it's not on page 2. Under step 6. So you cannot do it in their place. Well, but you know what, I won't be in town till, I guess, no, you can't help. You need to find a neighbor or a priest or a cousin or somebody to go over and do it, or have the inspector go do it. It will not be you. Under any circumstances, never. Because that's huge liability, and frankly, it's bad service to the client. It is so easy for you to make a mistake. That window deal we talked about earlier. Remember, I talked about the windows and the disagreement on the windows? Our agent went out and looked and said, oh yeah, new windows. Got new windows. What you have is new window glass, new paintings. Didn't have, so, you know, not only it made a mistake and make sure the agent, the buyer understood what window replacement meant, but he went out and said, yeah, everything's good. So the buyer now had recourse against us because buyer says, well, you told us it had been done. You told us it's been taken care of. $15,000. That's why I get overzealous about some of this stuff, because I see it. And chances are you won't see it. You know, rarely ever, because you come to these classes and you're doing the right thing.
That's right.
Now, you ready for some special negotiation notes here on dealing with all this? The buyer said, depending on the nature of the repair and the plans the buyer has for the property. You may get what Cynthia brought up earlier about dealing with money in lieu of. You got a buyer who's going to totally remodel the house. We don't care about repairs, except as leverage to negotiate a better price. Negotiate seller's concessions. So because you know what your buyer is going to want to do, it's going to help you negotiate that. Maybe your buyer is a contractor. You know, maybe your buyer has certain special areas that they can do as they work through the process. So they don't really need to push for some types of things because they can handle it better on their own as you work through it. So it's really important for you to have an understanding, because as you're negotiating this, what you've got is a buyer who's gained all this information. The buyer says, for this property to be worth what I'm paying for it, this property to be the right property for me and how I want to use it, I now know there are certain things that have to be done. So we're going to negotiate how those things get done. We got to that point now where we're going to negotiate. We're going to get good, clear language. We're going to strategize as we go through the process and doing it. And so when we talk about, you know, money in lieu of actual repairs, and we'll talk in a minute about the amendment. You can look at the money adjustment in dealing with is work through dealing with variables such as the lender's requirements, recommendations, and what they allow. And then it starts as a general rule, we don't want to deal with repair issues. Now, why do we not want to deal with repair issues? What's your thought there? Do what?
You were asking, why do we not want to deal with repair issues?
Yes. Why?
There's lender problems, there's reliability issues, there's overpaying, there's 100 things.
I thought they were about 90, but it might be. So one of the things that Cynthia brings up on why we don't want to deal with repairs. Big one is the lender. Lenders don't want to hear about repairs. When they know about the repairs, yeah, I know, we still want to hear. And one of the reasons, and I know Marcia, you deal with this, where they have a couple of amendments, one deals with repairs, one doesn't. And they do several amendments because they don't want to give the repair amendment to the lender. You can't do that. All amendments have to go to everybody. Lender has to get them and so forth. The lender is the big thing. Now, the other things that you thought about were what?
The workmanship is. The buyer chooses that it's going to be much better, but what happens if it's an HVAC and you cap it at $3,000 and it's going to require a lot more?
Yeah.
It's a new negotiation.
Yep. So one of the challenges with repairs is things don't always end up being what we thought they were going to be. One is escalation costs, things of that nature. Other is availability of materials. The other is liability issues, which brings up all of those things. So I think we can eliminate all the repair issues and replace all the repair issues with money.
Well, and I would put another caveat on there. Anytime you open up a wall or get in the attic or look at framing, there's another conditions, there's termites previously, there's unpermitted repairs. You're opening up a can of worms that you don't need to open up.
Yeah. And this, so when you do these kind of remodeling kinds of things, as you do those repairs, presuming the seller is doing it during the term of the contract prior to closing, and also when discovering new things, that seller has to direct us to deal with it, new money, new price, new whatever, so whoa. They're gonna move forward on that, even though they had agreed to it, which would be a big mistake on the seller's part, because those are not surprises that happen once in a blue moon, they happen all the time, on a regular basis. And so anytime you can move from that to, to seller concessions. So we talk about seller concessions, in that next paragraph, it references both 12A1B of the contract or the fourth item on the amendment form. You've got the amendment form in there, which we'll talk about in a minute. If at the beginning, when you're first negotiating, if you already have some sense of repair issues while you're negotiating the original contract, you can address that in 12A1B. Lenders really like this, as long as it doesn't max out. You'll have certain maximums allowed based on the type of loan, the down payment. And you'll have certain maxes, whether it's 3% or 6%, or in some cases 10%, as you work through that. But lenders are good with that. Now, we sometimes find, and Marcia, we were mentioning this earlier, is maybe they'll do a seller concession to item number 4, thank you, increases 12A1B. And everything is as good as you kind of work through that and deal with it, and it's within all the proper maxes as you go through it. And the lender's good with it, and everybody is happy in the situation. The buyer has to, we have to make sure that as we work through that we haven't mixed addendums in which a seller has agreed to do repairs on one and then money in lieu of. Sometimes you'll see in paragraph 9 of the amendment where seller and buyer put in there that, the seller concession is in lieu of repairs. Not a good statement, not an important statement. And so, well, I want to make sure they understand I'm not going to do any repairs, but I'm going to pay them this extra money. Well, you don't have to do any repairs anyway. You're not required to do any repairs. If you want to give them some extra money, fine. They can't take that money and then also make you do repairs unless you've got another amendment that you signed off on to agree to repairs. And then you also sign on a subsequent amendment agreeing to pay money. You didn't have any language in the second amendment superseding the first amendment. You find yourself a seller obligated to pay repairs and money. And that happens. Because agents aren't paying attention and let sellers handle. Well, the reason everybody understood, the reason we did the second one, we're going to give them that extra money, that $5,000. Everybody understood that. But that's not what the documents say. Not only is the seller got to pay him $5,000, he's got to do these repairs every agreed to. You make sure you've got that superseding language as you work through it. One of the things we love about cash transactions, even though cash transactions don't always stay in cash and they don't always close. One of the things is when we need to make adjustments for repairs, we don't have any lender problems. I have to worry about any of those issues. We generally don't have appraisals done, although I think a buyer in cash transaction should have an appraisal done as they work through that process. But cash deals, any adjustment in sales price is dollar per dollar in and out of a pocket. So it's a great and easy adjustment as you work through that. Does that make sense? Would you all agree to that? If we've got a cash transaction, then what we're negotiating here are repairs based on all the information we've got, what's prioritized, and how we set up the strategy, and we're negotiating that with the seller to have those, repairs taken care of. And if we want to get them done prior to closing, fine. If we're going to get them after closing, fine. We don't worry about their lender required repairs or not. Because there's no lender. For that reason, we love cash transactions, because we eliminate a whole set of challenges, a whole third party in there, and really screw things up. Any comments on the cash deal? Did you work through and deal with that?
How about if the cash deal, they buy the house and then they don't want, they are not, they are in the other country, they did not see it. They don't want to go through everything, they did not see the house before.
Okay, so we've got a sight unseen buyer who's in contract, buy our house and close on it remotely. They've never seen the property until after closing. First, we've got a form, sight unseen advisory. We have a form, so we tell the buyer there's a risk. If you close on a property and you've never seen it, when you finally see it, it may not be what you thought it was going to be. I mean, we got the technology now, we got the videos, we got all the stuff we can do where they can show things. But unless they can find somebody here who can actually, as a, somebody who can look at the property and really help them have a better sense of it. Even as an agent, when you go through and you video it and you show them all that stuff, when they first see the house, there's one thing that you cannot in any way, shape or form, piece of information that you won't have until you're there. I know what it is?
Feels.
Well, part of it, right?
Smell.
Smell, exactly, smell. What does a house smell like? And you're right, the feel of the house. People will come into a house and they say, whoa, oh, bad vibes, bad vibes. It be here, but the smell of a house, they never smelled it before. And now they have. So, man, we could never live here. For whatever reason, there's a risk. That's why they have to sign our form. So when somebody's going to buy a house up front, and they've never seen it, a new build, if they're buying the same model as the model home that's all furnished and nice, they need to know when they close and they go to the house, it's going to look different than the model home of the building. They just need to know that. So, what happened to the house I bought? Well, yeah, that's the border. But yeah, no, it's not. But it's a real challenge. And we've got foreign investors who buy those properties and they trust their agent. You've got to be very careful to make sure they understand. You can send videos, you can do all those things. Don't say, okay, and I went through the house and I sniffed everything and it smelled okay. Might smell okay to you, but it might not smell okay to them. That's a risk. You have foreign investors who buy the house, close on it, and never see it and have you rent it out. And then give it to somebody else who's going to manage it because it won't be used. But it'd be Cynthia, she can manage it. You work through that process. But it's a risk. But many of the foreign investors do that and they go through that process. And they just understand the risk. And in fact, they've got to sign off on the form that we provide them. That there is the risk. Is everybody?
From here or check form?
No, it's a form. It's what I call my form. It's one of our forms. That's one of our.
Okay.
We've got a sight unseen contract. We've got those kind of advisory notices that they have to sign off on. And it's in our intranet as you have that work through. Yeah, let's look at. You've got the amendment form here in your package. That's one of the negotiating strategies, things that we talked about. You need to be really familiar with this amendment form. 8 pre-printed specific items, 9th one that's other. Because this amendment form, as you look at what you're negotiating, can make use. Frankly, it's embarrassing. I see an amendment form and it's not properly completed. They used the wrong paragraph. It's just got to be correct. Now, if what you're going to do is some of the things that like Cynthia brought up, talked about, you're going to do a sales adjustment. It's number 1. It's paragraph number 1. That's where you address that. We got one. Paragraph number 9. Buyer and seller agree to, and they put the sales price in there. That's what paragraph number 1 is for. And when you put it somewhere else, it's not supposed to be, means you haven't read the form. And it's generally a bad thing for an agent to not read the form. Number 2 is typically the most common one that we use for repair requests. Mistake we make in number 2, because in number 2, it's got some good language, talks about seller's expense. Shall complete the following repairs and treatments. And we got paragraph 7, specific example deals with that. And you gotta do it in paragraph 7, talks about when you do it, prior closing. Pressure warrant, all that. And this is where you put that. Now, the mistake we make in this paragraph is you try to scrunch everything in there. Don't do it. Nice, simple phrase. See attached repair request list. See attached to repair request list. And then paper's cheap. Take a whole nother form. Nice little title, repair request, and then itemize 1 through 10 or whatever the number may be of all the repairs that the buyer is asking for. Because you've got a whole separate piece of paper or multiple pages, buyer can take their time and make sure their language is clear, specific, and understandable. And then you got signature block, so they sign off on it. That is referenced in paragraph 2. So that's part of this amendment. It's signed off by the buyer, and then it'll be signed off by the seller. And you've got them all set down, typed out. There is no Trek form for this. It's a form that you can create for your client alone. And because you've got it set out, it's easier for the seller to say, okay, we'll do these first 5, but we're not gonna do these last 5. You know, and so it'll line through the ones and initial ones they're not gonna do. And then they'll send that back to the buyer, and the buyer says, no, okay, we're glad you can do the first 5, but we really also need 6. We don't get 6, we're not gonna do these. But they get to go back and forth and negotiate that, and it's nice and clear what they do. If you try to scrunch it in paragraph 2, it's a mess. When you get through that, you can't even tell what everybody's agreed to. So is that what everybody already does? Yeah, Bob, we do that anyway. Do you say see attached repair request, or you say see attached?
No, we usually say, we just say see attached exhibit. And then on the exhibit A, it's exhibit A, and we put the address. So it's clear if it's for that.
Okay, you brought up an important point, and that attaching, yeah, put the address, and address of the property. In every addendum, in every situation, you need the address of the property.
Initial the exhibit, so.
Yeah.
It's clear that everyone has seen that exhibit.
Yeah, perfect. And maybe you need more time. It was pointed out, we can't get the repairs done in time. We don't want to escrow fund. We're going to change the closing date. That's an easy thing. It's paragraph 3. Because remember what this amendment is doing. It's changing something that's in the contract. So this is changing what paragraph 9 of the contract was their closing date. We talked earlier about seller. Question, yes, ma'am.
On back to when you I always have them initial that when you add a second page attached repair, I always have my buyers initial it to confirm that it was seen so it never can become detached. Is that what you recommend?
So you're saying in paragraph 2, when you write see attached repair, you have them initial that
The
statement?
second page, yes.
Not the statement.
Second page.
Well, the second page needs to be signed.
Exhibit A.
You need to have signature blocks, and it's.
So
got
not
pointed
just
out.
initials.
No,
Okay.
not just initials, signatures, and at the top of the page, you need to have the address, as Scott pointed out, have the address of the property, so we're clear what that goes with.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, thank you. And seller concession number 4, you're changing the amount. And remember, this can go either way. You can have negotiated some repairs, and in the contract, the seller had agreed originally to pay $5,000. He says, no, if I'm going to do this HVAC repair, I'm not paying that anymore. So this may change. What it was $5,000. It may change to $2,000, $3,000, or 0. So it can go either direction. So you're literally changing what was in the contract. The buyer and seller agreed to seller concession. You should work through that. But this is a real easy place for a seller to pay for repairs of the buyer without using the ugly R word? Joe? Okay, good. So.
So if you have money in here already, under 12A1B, let's say you had $1,000 when you originally negotiated the contract, and now you're increasing the seller concession for repairs of 5,000, you put 6. And then when you change it, you have to do the grand total, not just what the additional amount is. If you do 5, and it's only 5, that makes sense.
No,
If you already had 1,000,
what's the final number that you're gonna deal with?
6.
How much is the seller gonna agree to pay? Is it 1,000 original contract plus 5,000?
Yes, so it needs to be 6.
Yeah, if that's what they're gonna do, then the number in paragraph 4 here needs to be 6,000. But if that's the total,
Yes,
if the seller had already agreed to 1,000, buyer says, I want another 5,000, then 6 is what goes here, not that 5,000. Because this changes what is in the contract. If a contract had 1,000 and we put 5,000 or 6,000 here, what was in the contract OMB no longer exists. It's gone. So you're right.
so I've seen amendments where originally the seller agreed to, let's say, 5,000. And then during the negotiation of repairs, they agreed to an additional 2, and I've seen 2,000 here. So what that just did was it changed the original 5,000 to
2,000. Yeah, you're exactly right. So you be very careful with that. Yep.
Seller check.
I think makes good sense.
Yeah, seller check.
Yeah, so you do need to understand, this replaces what's in the contract. So it's not a matter of what's in the contract added to this. This is the new number,
And it replaces the original
Correct.
agreement.
the original contract.
5,000. Now it's 6,000. So it,
Well, if it's 1,000 so if the buyer's saying to the seller, you'd already agreed to 1,000, I want another 5,000, so I want a total of 6,000.
right,
6,000 what goes here.
right, and
And that changes what was in the contract. So that 1,000 in 12A1B of the contract no longer exists.
Okay, got it.
Go. Perfect. If there are lender required repairs, as you remember, in the contract, it states that neither party is required to pay for lender required repairs. But if they don't come to some agreement, what's going to happen to the contract? Terminates. But neither party is obligated to pay any lender required repairs. So if we have negotiated something and the buyer's lender says, well, buyer said, my lender says you gotta do this. So well, that's, you need to get a new lender. I got paper. As you deal with that, so they finally have come to some agreement on what they're gonna do. And so in the amendment, in that specific item, they go ahead and put that number in there. So they've now come to some agreement. So they're gonna pay this, buyer's gonna pay this. Because in the contract, there's no agreement. Paragraph 70 of the contract, there is no agreement on lender required repairs. I should work through it unless, if I hear that in there, you can agree to it, you work through it. That makes some sense. Everybody somewhat good with that.
Hey,
Is it-
Bob, it's Laura. Can I ask a
Yeah.
question? Does
Sure.
that go, if you are working on lender required repairs, does that go under number 2 or number 9?
No, it goes in number 5. I mean, it goes in number 5.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw that. I apologize. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Because when we talk about lender required repairs, if you know, in the contract itself, when it talks about them, it doesn't have anything in there that addresses who's going to pay for what. It just simply says neither party is required to pay. But if we don't work something out, I'm not going to terminate. So if the buyer and seller in the original contract, because in the original contract, at that point in time, they probably didn't know about lender required repairs. So they learn about it later in the inspection or the appraisal or whatever. And now the buyer and the seller come together and says, okay, yeah, we're going to agree on what we're going to do about lender required repairs. And now we got that worked out. And so we're going to put that number in item number 5. So that 5 only addresses lender required repairs. And what you've got in 2 are specific repairs that are addressed in that repair request attachment that you're gonna have in there too.
Got it. Thank you.
On the amendment number 9, if you don't know what the lender, if they're gonna be lender required repairs, could the seller put in there buyer to be responsible for any lender required repairs?
Why would you do that? So seller's gonna put in number 9.
This is his money's fault.
Because it's the lender required.
And so the seller's gonna have the buyer, or is gonna put in item number 9, that the buyer
It should be clarified before it comes up of who's responsible for it. Instead of deciding.
I think it'd be a huge mistake. I think you should do that. Because now you're asking buyer, would you please sign this blank check and we'll bill it out later? I don't think that's a good idea. That makes sense?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out if there's a way to determine before they come.
Because remember, if the buyer doesn't agree to pay it, what happens? Terminates. And that termination goes all the way to closing. If the day before closing, the lender says, oh, by the way, you need to do this. If you don't do this, contract terminates.
Like Paula just said, we've done that with the appraisal, with a waiver. Buyer agreed to take on that.
Two different scenarios.
Same
Yeah.
same kind of concept.
No, it's not the same concept. Why do you think it's the same concept, Paula?
You made the comment, it's like writing a blank check, and I said, well, they're writing a blank check with the appraisal waiver too, if they do a full waiver. That's what I said.
Well, they are, but that only addresses the appraisal. Here, we're dealing with a whole different issue of
Yeah.
lender required repairs.
And most of those repairs have to be completed prior to closing, so you are committing your buyer to making repairs, and something else could come up, and then they don't close, and then they've just done repairs for the seller. So never, I could do that.
Yeah, I think it would be a bad thing for a seller to put in there. I think it'd be a really bad thing for a buyer to agree to it.
The lender probably wouldn't agree to it either when they see it.
Yeah, probably not. Laura, is that you, Laura?
It's Suzanne.
Suzanne, what you
Okay,
got?
so if neither party will agree to pay for lender required repairs and it terminates, then the buyer gets their earnest money back, correct?
Correct. That's correct. That's what it says in 70 of the contract.
Okay, that's what I want to.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Absolutely. You're correct on that. Question? Yes, ma'am.
The number 7, the buyer waives the unrestricted right to terminate. If correct this one, it means all the restriction like the HOA, everything, appraisal is waived.
No. It only addresses the option right to terminate. The only addressing the unrestricted right has nothing to do with seller's disclosure, with HOA, with any other right of termination. It's only this one specific right of termination. That's all it addresses. Good question.
Okay, just the option day, right?
Yeah, well, just the option period. And the reason that a buyer may check off 7, they've asked for a lot of repairs. And the seller says, okay, I'll agree to these repairs. We're in the 5th day of a 10-day option period. I want you to give up the rest of the option. And so the seller requires the buyer to check off number 7. So the buyer has no more unrestricted right to terminate. Now, he may have other rights to terminate, like the HOA or sell disclosure notice or whatever, but this specific right goes away if they check off number 7. And that may be an incentive where the buyer encourages the seller to agree to repairs. And the buyer says, if you'll do this, I'll give up my option period. I'll give up the rest of the option period. And I've already paid you $500 for an option fee. So this is a really good deal for you, seller.
Gotcha. Okay,
Okay,
thank
we're
you.
good?
And I have another question about what's the difference number 1 and the number 3? It's all about the if buyer doing financial, the number 9 is changed to the price and the number 1 change the loan price is the same or it's different.
Now, number one,
Number 1
okay,
and
I'm
the
not
number
sure.
3.
Okay, number 1 only deals with,
Oh, sorry, number 1 and number 4. What's the
okay.
difference?
Well, I'm not sure why you're pulling those two together, because number 1 just deals with the buyer and seller have agreed to adjust the sales price. And when they adjust the sales price, if there's financing, they'll also adjust the loan amount and the down payment. If it's a cash transaction, then all they're adjusting is the sales price. And you're trying to compare that to number 4, which is a seller concession. One has nothing to do with the other. Two totally separate issues,
Gotcha, yes.
okay?
Okay,
We
thank
good?
you.
Thank you. And if the buyer in negotiation and they're working with some challenge with their lender and they need more time for the buyer approval, third-party financing, just the buyer approval, then that's not item number 8. And it may be the seller says, okay, I chose your offer because your lender said you're perfect, you're great. And so everything's been done and I'm doing repairs. And we're not scheduled to close to the 20th of June. I want to close sooner. I want to close earlier as you work through the process. And I don't, your financing is, you sold me on your financing. So I want this to be, right now, you've got 14 days or 20 days in the third-party financing and for buyer approval. I want you to shorten that. I want it to be sooner. So they can change it either direction and make it sooner, make it longer, but that's all number 8 is. Number 9, if you got anything else that's not covered in the first 8, remember the rules that apply to special provisions, paragraph 11 of the contract, apply to number 9. Can't be practicing law, can't get creative, can't be sticking things in there. There should be attorney prepared, something of that nature. So you can't be doing that. So you see in the negotiation repairs, all these things we talk about, understanding the amendment form, how important that is as you work through the process. So be ready to go. And we've talked about the walkthrough confirmation acceptance form. Now, the last form you've got here is rebate language. If you have a buyer or there's a buyer in the transaction and there's financing, you have to have very specific language, either originally in your buyer representation agreement or an amendment to the buyer representation agreement. And you see on this page, the exact specific language. So if you have the buyer, and what happens way too often is you have conversations. And in the conversation, the buyer feels like the buyer's agent says, yeah, I'll give you 1% of my commission. Yeah, we'll work that out. It's not a problem. Yeah, we can do it. But they just have a conversation. They don't have anything in writing. And they don't have this language in there. And so we've got a problem. Because when the buyer's agent finally talks to the lender and says, oh, by the way, I'm giving a $3,000 rebate to the buyer. Are you okay with that? I said, no, not at all. He's totally maxed out on everything. He doesn't get any more money because all money, when there's financing, all money going to the buyer must be approved by the lender and show up on the settlement statement. And that's what the language is here. So this language needs to be very specific and the buyer needs to agree to it. If this doesn't get agreed to, you cannot rebate it. You cannot rebate money to the buyer unless, one, it's approved by the buyer's lender in writing, and it shows up on the settlement statement. It'd be a line item, shows up there. Now, if you happen to have the seller and there's going to be a rebate to the buyer, the additional step is you need your seller client to authorize you to rebate to a buyer. They've got to agree to let you do that as you work through it. Try to avoid like the plague rebates to a buyer. That's a slippery slope. I know sometimes you find yourself having to do it because your buyer says, well, you know what? I chose you, but there's a line out the door of buyers who will give me half their commission if I work with them. And you've got to decide if you're going to do that or not. If you're going to rebate them, make sure you use this language. If you don't use this language, and not do it at all. It's a really slippery slope. Please, got to have the language. So sometimes when you tell the buyer says, okay, and when you first have that first conversation, and it'll always be the buyer brings it up. You'll never say to the buyer, oh, by the way, I get 3% from the other side unless you wanted part of it. Did you want part of that? No. You're never gonna have that. So it's always gonna be the buyer bringing it up. And if they bring it up, says, okay, not a problem. Here's the language that has to go either in the buyer rep agreement or the amendment to the buyer rep agreement. If these two things don't happen, I cannot rebate you the money. Got to have that conversation. We've had situations where that wasn't the case and had problems. I mean, up in a tractor plane. You've got to be able to deal with it. Any questions on that? Good.
And could you repeat the first sentence? I'm sorry, I went. My brain. Construction, new construction, like a lot of time builders will say to the buyer's agent, so it could be me. I'll give you a 5% commission. Instead of,
Bonuses,
yeah, bonus.
bonuses or higher commission.
Yeah, should I?
Okay, that's not a rebate.
No.
I mean, do you want to give part of that to the buyer?
Yeah.
So you're getting more than 3%, and you may say, you know what? I'll give you that extra 2% out of bonuses. By the way, in paragraph 11 of the buyer rep agreement, that's addressed. Construction, that's all addressed in paragraph 11. So you get to decide. Now, if you decide to do that, and they're doing financing, the buyer's lender needs to know about that. You need to use this language. If I'm going to pay that money to you, rebate that money to you, some share my commission with you, then this language has to be there. It has to be there in the buyer rep agreement. It's got to be in the settlement statement. And the builder say, oh, no, you just do that on the slide. You know, meet with them in the Walmart parking lot after closing. So if they're offering that bonus and with that process, that's a rebate to them. You're sharing your commission with them. You gotta have the language, you gotta do it.
Do you? When I do a listing agreement and I say, if you buy new construction, this is what my
When
charge.
you do a buyer rep agreement.
I mean, a buyer
Yeah.
agreement, I'm sorry. This is what I charge 3%, the same as I would if I was listing your house, I would charge you 3%.
But you gotta make a decision because that language is actually in paragraph 11 of the buyer rep agreement. And you got to decide right then. It's in there. So when we get through here, you
You
go.
put that construction paragraph?
Yes, it does. It's in paragraph 11.
Read the whole thing, so.
Yeah, it's okay. But reality is, have that conversation because if your buyer is gonna be looking at new homes. And you know their bonus and things like that, the right time for you to talk about that with the buyer is now. So you know what? Sometimes there'll be bonuses, and my policy of how I work with buyers is if I get anything above the 3%, then I'll share that with you. But here's the language that has to be in the buyer rep agreement. It has to be approved by your lender, it has to be in the settlement statement. Or your decision may be, my policy is, I always get that.
In paragraph.
But
11.
paragraph 11, you can get away with that up front because it's not there yet. It hadn't happened. You know, so at the very beginning, because they like you, they want to work with you, want you to represent them, be your advocate, everything's great and they love you. So, okay, and by the way, my policy is whatever, some builders will pay me 3%, some builders pay me 5%, some builders pay me $1. Whatever it is, I'm okay with it. I'm not going to come back to you for more money. But whatever it is the builder's gonna pay, it's all mine. I get it all. And you can say it like that, but you're gonna give them content. Right then they agree to it because it's not happening yet. And by the way, we went through that period, what, year and a half ago? For some of the builders, it was $1,000. That was it. They didn't pay you 3% or 5% like that. So you said you made the decision right then, you're gonna bite the bullet. I'll take whatever the builder gives me, and that's the deal. Or you may have said, if the builder doesn't pay me at least 3%, buyer, you're gonna have to pay me the difference. That's a decision you make right then. You go through that process.
And also,
Yes, ma'am.
where does the builder, they have a lot of concession? Where does that go?
It'll show up.
They have a lot of concessions.
Okay, if they got concessions to the buyer, that's in the contract.
In there.
That's not what we're talking about on the rebates, that's in the commission. So that's in the contract where they say, you know, here are the incentives, here's the situation with the buyer, give this amount of money if you use our lender, if you use our title company, if you buy our lunch, or something like that. What about it lunch? Okay, guys, any last second questions? Zoomers, you got anything?
Hey, Bob, Suzanne Mitchell again. I have one question back to the amendment, paragraph 5, where if the lender repaired.
Where it's what?
Yeah, if the lender lender required repairs, I'm trying to say it right. If you can't come to agreement and you have to terminate the contract, how do you terminate the contract at that point? Because you're not really, it's not on the notice of buyer's termination of contract.
No, it actually is.
It is?
Yep. And due to the property approval issue, so when you look at the track promulgated, 9 items of the termination, it's there. If you don't find it, give me a call or send me an email.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much for being here. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bob.
Bob.
Thank you,
Thank y'all.
Great.
That's such one thing. I know.
Thanks, Bob.
I guess.